For the first video on this channel, I have tested a few limiters to see which is best suited for mastering your music. The only requirement for limiters to be included in this video was that I have access to them, so all the limiters featured in this video are free, save for Ozone 8 Elements, which I had gotten for free earlier, since iZotope tends to give it out for free every once in a while. Remember that this is by far not a conclusive test, as I've only tested a few scenarios with songs I had handy and only focused on the limiting part, disregarding any other functionalities the limiters had. I also, obviously, only tested a small amount of plugins as mentioned before. However, you will be able to do the same tests for your limiters, as I will include a download link to the song snippets I used, as well as a detailed rundown of what I did for the tests in the video description down below. The limiters tested were Vlad G's limiter number 6, Ozone 8 Elements, Loudmax, Image Line's Fruity Limiter and Maximus, Kilohertz Limiter, Sonic Anomalies Unlimited, LVC Audio's Limited Z, and the Loser Mastering Limiter from Raya.js. As for testing methodology, I ran two tests, one testing a more general mastering chain and the second testing singular instances of limiters. For the mastering chain tests, I took a snippet from 4 songs of mine, which are an unreleased tropical house track, a rhythm track, a future garage tune, and a house song. Links to the full songs in the description as well. For each of these, I created a mastering chain that pushed slightly higher than I usually would push them with limiter 6, and then create that chain with the exact same values with every tested limiter. I also created another chain on the rhythm track where I went way overboard to see how each plugin would react to that. The exact values used for each chain can be found in the video description once again. For the singular instance tests, I used one limiter and pushed the rhythm track into it by 9 decibels. For every test, I left the plugins on their default settings, save for activating oversampling and intersampling protection, or true peak limiting as some call it, when applicable. I also deactivated any non-limiter options, such as Ozone's EQ and Stereo Imager or Limiter 6's compressor. There were a few slight variances in settings due to limitations on the limiter side. Unlimited wouldn't let me set the threshold to 0, but to -0.01 dB, which should not make a considerable difference but should still be noted. I faced a similar limitation with Limited Z, for which I used the threshold of -0.1 dB, as a 0 dB ceiling is locked to the paid version. Also, the kilohertz limiter would not let me set accurate 0.5 dB gain value, so when such a value is tuned to 0.5 dB, the kilohertz equivalent is 0.53 dB. The only limiters that had multiple limiting modes were Ozone and Limiter 6. Due to unfamiliarity with Ozone, I left it on the default mode. As for Limiter 6, in the chain tests, I used the ISP precise setting for the first instance and ISP fast for the other ones. For the singular test, I used ISP fast. On to the results of the test. These are my own impressions when listening to the examples on Kali Audio LP6 in an untreated room and on Audio Technica ATH M30X. Raw videos of the tests are linked in the description if you want to listen to them yourself, both as a YouTube link and as a download. Firstly, the chain test. Across the board, there were a few noticeable things. Limiter 6 and Ozone were mostly comparable, with Ozone being slightly cleaner for the future garage sample and slightly quieter for the house song. Loudmax was usually one loudness unit quieter than those two, but was mostly the cleanest of the bunch. Image Line's limiters both did not hold up at all, showing a very shaky sound due to the default settings, atrocious release times, and being quieter than the others. There was no audible distortion happening, so that's a win, I guess. Maximus generally was about one loudness unit quieter than Fruity Limiter. The kilohertz limiter surprisingly held up pretty well, but was a bit quieter than Loudmax across the board. In the house sample, it did slightly introduce some shakiness, but nothing all too terrible. Unlimited did color the sound, but was between Loudmax and Limiter 6, sometimes as high as Limiter 6 in terms of loudness. Limited Z is comparable to Limiter 6 across the board, but sometimes is a bit less clean. Also, for some reason, it did absolutely not hold up for the future garage sample, introducing some real odd distortion, but being the loudest of the bunch. I tested it with the other mixes from the same EP and got a similar issue, though not quite as noticeable. The conclusion from this is to not use Limited Z if you create future garage, I guess. Raya.js was comparable to the Fruity Limiter loudness wise, but had a very clean sound to it. In the hard pushing case, a few things became very noticeable. Limiter 6, Ozone, Unlimited, and Limited Z all had a quite distorted sound, Limited Z being the cleanest and the loudest of the bunch. Loudmax once again had a completely clean sound, but only went up to -8.5 LUFS, 1 LU below the quietest and 3 loudness units below the loudest of the aforementioned limiters. Fruity Limiter and Maximus were both incredibly shaky but did not distort the sound per se, probably due to the long release times that create the shakiness. They were the quietest of the bunch too. The kilohertz limiter was relatively clean but slightly shaky, hitting the same loudness as Loudmax. Raya.js, while clean too, only went to -9 LUFS. As for the singular instance testing, limiter 6 was once again very distorted and close to the -4.3 LUFS mark. Ozone had a cleaner sound but was slightly shaky and only at -6 LUFS. Loudmax, while clean as ever, was only around -7 LUFS, hitting -6.9 at highest. Nice. The image line limiters were once again very shaky and the quietest of the bunch. Maximus did introduce some distortion too, so when pushing one instance to an extreme, the long release time did not seem to help as much. The kilohertz limiter was once again comparable to Loudmax but got slightly higher loudness-wise. Unlimited distorted a lot but only made it to the -5.0 LUFS mark. Limited Z, while very distorted, nailed a loudness of -3.5 LUFS, making it the loudest of the bunch. Raya.js was slightly shaky but otherwise comparable to Loudmax and kilohertz. Remember that this scenario is quite arbitrary, as one should ideally not push one single limiter extremely but use several and only push them to an extent. There are a few conclusions to be drawn from this. If you know what you're doing while mastering, I can wholeheartedly recommend limiter 6 and Ozone, closely followed by limited Z. These push the loudest while still maintaining a relatively clear sound, and all also have other capabilities such as Ozone's equalizer and stereo imager. If you are a beginner who just wants to hit some kind of loudness while maintaining a clear sound, go with Loudmax, or if that doesn't work for some reason, the kilohertz limiter. These have proven to essentially be idiot-proof. Even if you throw absurd settings at them, they didn't distort, they just refuse to push louder. The only other limiter that I tested that I would recommend is unlimited, but I would only use that one for limiting single channels as it does introduce some coloring. Thank you for your attention. Once again, all the resources required to do these tests are provided in the description, as well as recordings of my tests. If you send me recordings of your tests, I will include them in the description as well. Thank you for your time.